Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those based in Europe. Thanks to new technologies, we have Jayne Durden based in the US, in Boston, and myself based in Paris, France. We're delighted to have you among us for this webinar about global IP enforcement and brand trademark counterfeiting. My name is Aline Ouaknine. I'm Director of the Innovation Department at Leaders League, which is a media agency, but also a ranking agency, and that organizes international events. So I'm going to let Jayne Durden introduce herself before we really get to the subject.
Thanks, Aline. I'm Jayne Durden, and I'm the VP of Strategy at Anaqua, as you said, based in Boston. We're the leading intellectual property management system provider, and we provide technology to help organizations manage their patents, trademarks, and other intellectual property. We work with a lot of the top manufacturers and providers and innovators around the world, and particularly also with their law firms. So we're very interested in making sure that we provide software and technology that helps IP owners make sure that they can monitor and maintain their patents, trademarks, and other forms of IP. I've got a particular interest in counterfeiting, though, Aline, as you know, I come to Anaqua from a career working in intellectual property, particularly in trademarks and brand management. When I came to the United States about 20 years ago, I started to work at PPG Industries. PPG Industries is a leading manufacturer of paint and at that time glass and also eyeglass lenses through Transitions Optical. And in the management and maintenance of the global trademark portfolio, what became really evident was that misuse of trademarks was one thing, but increasingly over the early 2000s to mid 2010s, we were seeing a real proliferation of counterfeit. Who believe in paint, industrial paint? But this had a massive impact on the value of the brand. And it became really evident that this was an area that all intellectual property specialists really needed to start to keep an eye out for and actually put together a strategy. Hence, my great interest in the area.
Definitely. Well, what's interesting is that usually common people look at counterfeiting thinking about luxury goods or how the little harm it could do. But from your professional background, you see on a daily basis the impact at the industrial level of the harm of counterfeiting. So maybe to give us an overview, because Anaqua works with lawyers, with service providers, with corporates also on their IP matters, do you have a lot of data on how counterfeiting is, well, lived through these different parts?
Absolutely. This has really become an area of really interesting focus for us. It was brought to us by a customer, a vehicle manufacturer, that was struggling with being able to actually gather data for themselves. Vehicle manufacturers, as we'll talk about later, are one of the most hit by counterfeiting. And what they were struggling with was, how do we collect enough data? And so we actually spent a lot of time looking at industry data, because we were surprised, as you said. I think it's quite well known that, look, fancy jogging shoes and high-level purses are often what we consider to be counterfeit goods. But shockingly, in the global industry, the top three counterfeit goods are vehicle replacement parts, so repair parts for your vehicle, and even deeper other parts that go into vehicles these days. Shockingly, for any of us who travel at the moment, it is aerospace replacement parts, so parts for engines for planes and other parts like that, seat parts and things like that inside the planes. And then the third, very pertinent at the moment, are pharmaceuticals. And so I think it's been well known for other drugs beforehand, but certainly the pharmaceutical industry is being hit by counterfeits for COVID vaccines at the moment. And you can see the absolute impact that counterfeits have when we look at those three areas. These are areas that hit us all as people, as a community, and yet this is very little talked about. It's not really understood by consumers, let alone a lot of people at large. And so I think therein lies the problem. What we did was to do some research looking though at consumer or general public awareness, because we knew this fact, this had been brought to us, and so we thought, well, what is the problem? Why is this not spoken about as much? And so we authored a study where we interviewed 1,000 consumers, ordinary consumers, and we asked them what they thought of counterfeits. And to be honest, I thought we were going to get some juicy statistics, but it was actually a little shocking. So we found that basically you would think that maybe the more money somebody has, the more associated they might be with premium brands. No, not necessarily. So we had 46% of the people in the survey themselves, 460 people, knowingly had bought counterfeit goods. So they knowingly bought something. This meant not that they bought something and afterwards discovered it. Nope, absolutely knowingly did it. In fact, 30% of them had done it more than once. And so you can see that if this is the tip of the iceberg, if on the consumer brands, the ones that we said are very prolific, but are actually not truly the problem, we have the problem here of consumers themselves not necessarily even moderating their behavior and then not buying counterfeit goods. And it got sort of worse. So we would like to think that maybe this is a problem that we could then moderate by education, and that maybe this is a generational issue. No, millennials were absolutely actively buying counterfeit goods.
That's interesting. Do you have more specific statistics on the generational impact on buying counterfeited goods? Does the canal of buying also, whether you buy online goods, whether, well, we'll reach the industrial level afterwards, yeah. But is there a question of generation when it comes to serenely buying counterfeited goods?
Yeah, look, so we've had to make some assumptions here, but we've been thinking long and hard about this. What we said was 70% of Gen Zs and 63% of millennials admitted to purchasing counterfeits. So it was actually higher in the younger generations. I'm feeling very old here. And when we looked at that, we also started to look at potentially their buying patterns. It's much more likely, and I have teenage kids, they buy everything online these days. They don't walk into a store. They don't stand there with a registered reseller of a good, and they don't do it. They're also admittedly buying short cycle fashion products. And so therefore what they're interested in is something quick, something effective, that will stand by their brand or might make a statement to people, but very, very different buying patterns. So yeah, our assumption and what we're surmising is, yes, that the different buying patterns now, the move to online purchasing being almost entirely prevalent in this age group, and online purchasing associated with embedded ads in social media was likely certainly driving this. And you've got very little ability to be able to actually monitor the quality, let alone the authenticity of goods. And so, yeah, this is likely not to go away anytime soon. So
that's a roughy start.
Yeah.
Was the survey oriented to specific industries, or was it on general counterfeiting, including all different type of industries?
Yeah, no, we asked generally across it. So we were asking around awareness. And so what we were trying to drive to was whether or not there was awareness that even some of this sort of potentially, quote, less harmful counterfeiting does have an impact. So in the United States, there's been a lot of work that's been done to look actually at the fairly illicit harm that counterfeits have. So sure, you buy a pair of $20 Nikes on the corner of the street. What's the harm, right? What's the harm? Well, actually, the harm is quite great. There's the harm to a brand. A lot of consumers don't seem to be very worried about that, which is interesting. But the secondary harm is that it's been shown over here, certainly to be very directly linked. So the sale of counterfeit goods are often directly linked to funding organized crime. They're quite often a mechanism for laundering money, for getting money back into, whether it's drug money or other money. And there's other forms of harm too. So you often find that a lot of these products are manufactured overseas with child labor or enforced labor, or they're brought in by enforced labor. And so there are actual harms that are due to society. What is harder to get people to look at, but what was shocking us though was, come on consumers, are you not concerned though to the harm to you? And this is where, if you rip the top of all of these statistics off, I think it gets even more interesting, but pretty horrifying, right? So if the top 3 goods are these car parts, plane parts, and pharmaceutical parts, consumers are at a massive risk of harm and injury. So if counterfeit COVID vaccines are in the marketplace, there is physical harm to people, and there is societal harm to people with raising fear of vaccines. With the automotive parts, clearly there is harm. You're driving your vehicle, you put your foot on the brake, and your brake drum is a counterfeit part. Your car may not stop. You may cause yourself and others harm. And so that is it. I think you found the direct statistic around that, Aline.
Well, you brought the idea of, well, the concept that there's no hierarchy in counterfeiting in terms of harm. It could be, well, harm for the brands, it could be harm for the people, but there's also a lot of security, safety for consumers that are sometimes too disconnected from their perspective. When we prepared this webinar, we found out that over 40% of car parts are counterfeited. And
that's shocking. Shocking.
And worse than that, about 20% of fatal car accidents are due to counterfeited parts. So it's more about increasing the awareness for the final consumers on how much harm can counterfeiting do to all the different parts that are engaged in the whole, not only supply chain, but consuming system. So would you like to go deeper maybe in the industrial focus industry? Because I believe you've had an extensive experience working for a painting manufacturer back in Asia. Would you like maybe to go a bit deeper in
absolutely
to explain what
absolutely.
you've seen?
So look, as I said, I was quite surprised to find that industrial paint, we're not talking about architectural paint here that gets sold at stores for you to paint your house. This is paint for bridges. It was paint for the Olympic Village in China. It was paint for aerospace applications. This is a very technical, very specific kind of paint. And we were increasingly concerned to make sure that we were monitoring for all levels of counterfeit product. The difficulty with counterfeits is that there are ranges of counterfeit, or ranges of harm and origin for it. So number one is that a can of paint has none of your product in it, nothing at all to do with your product. and it might have a label that looks similar to yours, and a purchaser or somebody in the supply chain thinks that is yours. When it gets applied to a bridge, the problem that could have is that it may contain corrosive chemicals. It certainly won't have the properties of the original paint, and it may cause harm to the bridge. It may, who knows what will happen. And so you have a direct issue of the product in the can has nothing to do with your product. As I said, the damage there is damage to the actual equipment and massive damage and potential original liability back to the original brand owner. And so that was something we were very concerned to do. This is somewhat easier to deal with than what happens in the middle. What can happen in the middle is that you can end up maybe with not your product, but your label, partially your product and partially your label, and this problem in the middle where it may be part of yours and part not. It becomes very difficult to detect, and so there's a really interesting industry of chemical investigators in this area checking, you know, is this our product? Is this not our product? What's the chemical marker for this? What does it look like? In fact, there is a specific area of expertise in counterfeit management that looks at packaging, because often the way the packaging applies tells us whether or not a product has been counterfeited, or at least the labeling and packaging is counterfeiting. And so there's a specialty, Aline, it's fantastic, in how glue is applied when labels or when packages are put together. That's often an indicator that something is not an original product. But the worst kind of problem occurs with what's actually not a counterfeit, but it is not a true supply of your product, and that's grey market products. And this is definitely a problem in manufacturing jurisdictions. What it basically means is you license the manufacturing of your product to be done, say, in a plant in China. There are 100 cans of paint made, and 2 of them walk out the back door with an employee. Now, this doesn't sound problematic, but if it's done on a high enough stage, then what happens is you end up with a secondary supply. And the secondary supply isn't going through your main supply chain. So yes, the paint is manufactured or your product is manufactured. It would ordinarily then go through your normal supply chain. That would include licensed distributors, licensed delivery mechanisms of your products. And so for anything that contains chemicals, you know that this is a problem, it needs to be distributed appropriately, licensed shipping, manufacturers, etc. But once the product walks out your back door and becomes a grey market, it is your manufactured product, but it's no longer going through your supply chain, your distribution, and your quality assurance program. That becomes really, really problematic. You can't tell that it's not your product very easily. There are some mechanisms for being able to do it. Your consumers certainly can't. So even if you raise awareness of how to find an authentic product, it is with an authentically manufactured product. It just went this way instead of this way. The problem is they can certainly undercut your market, and so undercut your pricing. It disrupts relationships with your distributors, your licensed distributors, and it causes disruption within the market. But primarily, as I said, the problem is that you cannot assure this confidence in the process through your supply chain, which is what licensing is about. And so it's really problematic. I was surprised, like I said, I can see it certainly happening with an iPhone or something that would be easily consumed. I was really quite, I remember my reaction at start being, you know, like, we're doing this within industrial chemical products, and yes, it certainly is, because it's lucrative. It's a lucrative business for people to get into, to undercut legitimate businesses. Yeah.
And we have the pleasure of welcoming among us Pierre Gondor, who we can't hear, unfortunately. but the idea of the focus on the car industry, I hope your mic is going to work eventually, Monsieur Gondor, who used to be IP director for Peugeot Citroën for about 20 years, and who's now an expert at the Paris court for IP infringement problematic. Can you hear us, Pierre?
Hello, hello. Do you hear me well? Or?
There's a bit of an echo, but we can hear you.
It will be better now because I have two connections together, so there is a little problem with the sound.
All right.
Well,
can we hear you? I think it's better.
I did not hear you now.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for joining us. And maybe that will allow us to do a deeper focus on counterfeiting into the automotive industry. Maybe since our attendees don't know you, you could introduce yourself in a few words before. Pierre, if you want to introduce yourself, otherwise that looks like a counterfeited camera, sometimes even.
Yeah. You hear me, you see me, but I don't hear you.
Oh.
Maybe there is a problem with
So we're very sorry about that technical problem. If it comes back, please join the conversation. We would be happy to have your perspective. And then Jayne just opened the conversation about the complexity of distribution networks, on how people can now find any products by themselves. So old, very trusted distribution networks are also not being condemned, but their work is a bit undermined by the operation of platforms. So when it comes to distribution networks, what is the responsibility of the platforms in terms of counterfeited products? Jayne, if you could enlighten us a bit on that part.
Absolutely. So I think one of the main issues with counterfeiting too, Aline, is that owners and manufacturers and their licensed distributors suffer from either too much or not enough information. And so what we tend to find is that either there are a lot of questions, but people don't know who to pass the information to take action, or there is not enough information for the legal teams to be able to take action and investigate. As you could hear from me, this is complex stuff to figure out where the goods are coming from, where they're being sold, how you stop it. When we're talking about consumer goods or even some automotive replacement parts where we find them in vehicles, just stopping them from being put into a vehicle is not enough. What we have to do is to trace it all the way back. So the key to all of this, are we okay?
Please go on. I'm wondering on how can you actually put on the system to trace it back internally to the company?
Well, we can't, but all sorts of people can. And so the key that people have found is that they need a mechanism for that information to get back. And this is what led to us working to partner with our customer, the vehicle manufacturer, that realized that if they could give a mechanism to their organization and their licensed distributors to notify the legal team every time they thought there was a problem, that they could start to gather the amount of information that they'd need. And so it's really quite simple. What the app, so we have what's called the AntiCounterfeit App in Anaqua's AQX product, and this is an iPhone app or a phone app that enables people who are on the ground to simply gather the information that's required. So what's usually required is you need a photograph, and you need a time and a date and a place where this is happening. And so by simply requiring those fields of information that the legal team will need later to be filled out and to be gathered and to send straight back into the legal team, they've actually really effectively done something that has helped to at least start to get them in a position where they can more effectively take action. And so they're finding that they're gathering more information, they're able to actually be able to see the extent of the problem, because all of a sudden this app has enabled the team to be able to collect this information. It's still early days, so we're really interested to see what this customer is doing and how they're doing it. But I think what's been really key, and what we heard loudly and clearly from them and other customers, is you can't just do a little bit of this. You have to put together a strategy to take action, a strategy to enforce your intellectual property rights, including against counterfeiters. And you need to decide how you're going to do that without it costing you more than the harm. And therein lies the problem. So I think what's been interesting is this app has enabled a lot of information without too much expensive time being spent by the legal team yet, and so therefore justifying the gathering of the information. And that's certainly, I think, the key to this. With a lot of other organizations, we hear them starting to have conversations that say, look, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was looking at my budget and determining how much money, what percentage will I spend on clearance of a brand or clearance of innovation? What percentage of my budget will I spend on protecting? And then what percentage will I spend on enforcement? And by enforcement, often they meant litigation. And instead, this litigation or enforcement piece has certainly swung in some organizations to include a good chunk of that budget being set aside for enforcement action in the counterfeit area, which I think is really valuable.
Well, not only valuable, but essential for the company, because the way you describe the importance of IP could be linked to the importance of data today, and how the wealth of the company is located inside the company. So
absolutely,
what do you put in place at Anaqua, maybe to help implement this pedagogy with your customers, and and maybe, I don't know, formation master classes to the other departments than the legal departments that do understand how costly it is and how it affects badly the company, the brands, and its expansion. But for the other departments, the manufacturer, the supply chain, how do you increase awareness?
Great question. So you said it earlier, it's about access to information, and that's actually what Anaqua is all about. So we're based on the idea that historically in the IP legal area, we gather information because you need that information to prosecute the patents and trademarks. But increasingly, we've realized that access to information and input from other parts of the business is essential. You're exactly right. Intellectual property, brands, and innovation are a massive part of the valuation of companies now, and there's a lot of work that's been done to show exactly what that proportion is. It can be up to 1/3 of the valuation of some companies. If that is true, then we need more people around the business to understand what that intellectual property is, what you need to do to use it properly, and what you need to do to enforce and maintain it. So I'll give you an example. With our software, what we are able to do is to connect research and development, so the innovators, to the legal department and to the marketing department, and also to other people throughout the business. And we do this by having what's called a persona-based approach to our software. So there's a lot of information that sits there. Not everybody needs that. Yes, the lawyers need some, but everybody needs some. So if you are a scientist and you're developing a new product, you have access to be able to see, what do we already own? what can I do that adds innovation? We have this wonderful customer of ours. They're in the financial industry, and they wanted to drive more innovation. So they're using our product to actually help generate more ideas. They're basically running, it's a little bit sort of a gamification of innovation. But what they've done is to very publicly state what their strategy is. They want to drive more innovation in certain areas. Please help us within the company to do that. And they're using our software to drive those ideas in. In addition, we work with a lot of other organizations where consumer goods, footwear, sporting footwear, and they want to make sure that people are using the brands properly, that they're proud of the brands and that they are really great ambassadors for the brand. And so they give access to that information so people can use it. And then finally, as we said, access to information and a clear set of communication so that if someone within the organization says, that doesn't look right, is that right? They can go and take action. Because Aline, I think you're exactly right. There is direct value to brands and to innovation to a company, but the way that they do that is by monetizing. So the way you do it is to make sure that your distributors and licensees are enabled to do that. To be honest, I mean, that's a pretty valuable contract. And so you've now got a second group of people, these distributors and licensees, that are also very interested in making sure that you and they use the brands and use the innovation correctly. And so they also gain value from that at the same time. So just the sharing of information and access to information, but in line with a company's strategy for how important their intellectual property is. And that's what we do at Anaqua. We give access and we give the right people the information through the life cycle so that they can be great ambassadors of intellectual property.
It's quite challenging to find the proper balance between internal pedagogy and management of the intellectual property assets, and balancing all the fights and strategy that you have, that companies have to implement in the world, as in which extension would you consider, which country would you like, would you prioritize rather than others. So when it comes to managing your IP assets, you have to be sharp, fast, visionary, pragmatic. So between the balance of these two ecosystems, whether it's internal or external, what if you could give us, well, we don't have much time left, but an overview of what you've seen, what strategies are currently operating best?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest strategies that works the best is honestly getting all people within an organization, as I said, to be complete brand ambassadors. I think Nike is a great example of this, right? Quite famously, I've got friends who work there. They bring a tattoo artist to to company functions because people literally wear that brand on their ankle with the swoosh being tattooed. And incredible the loyalty from people within the organization back to the brand. Not suggesting that that's a strategy for every organization. I'm not going to put the Anaqua logo on my shoulder, although I love my company. But honestly, your own people are your best ambassadors and your best eyes for this. But I think the next part is raising awareness within your consumer base. So although it goes a little against the results of the survey, I've just told you that we think that consumers are fairly lax at the moment. I think it's actually very, very important. So I think brands need to drive to get consumers to act and to pull at some of the sensitivities of consumers. I think recently, actually, I take it back to my millennials and my teenagers, it is interesting. We know that this generation of consumers will act and will change their purchasing strategies based on personal beliefs. Plenty of my daughter will not buy goods that she knows are linked to child labor, for example. So how do we as organizations, how do we as brand managers then help to drive that link back to consumers so that we can help them say, you should be buying our goods because we are manufactured in America, i.e. we can control the distribution channels, we are authentic, we ensure that our products are authentic. And why is that important? Because it's safe for you, it's safe for our community and our economic system. So I think truly that's the next bastion of doing it, is actually actively going off and getting consumers to do it. Some very high-end brands do this quite famously. So Coach actually publishes the details that consumers can determine whether or not the purse or the wallet that they just bought is authentic. And it's fascinating. It's quite famous. I wish I'd brought mine with me. Inside there is a label and it's got a number on it, but that's not the only mechanism that people can use to tell that it's authentic. There's some quite sophisticated issues to do with the length of the stitch and where they put the care tag and things like that inside their goods. And people do take notice of this. People who want to buy authentic goods take notice of this. Quite famously, when you're buying a baseball cap here in the US, it comes with a holographic sticker now on the goods, and we see this more increasingly on consumer purchase goods as a mechanism for looking to make sure that things are authentic. So I do think that there are ways that we can do this. I think it's hard, and I think it's about brand owners actually getting back at the whole concept of what is a brand. A brand is around creating a relationship and a loyalty from a consumer because they know where the origin and the standard of the goods come from. And if brand owners get back to that and actually remind their consumers of that through programs that encourage more purchase and a more awareness of authentic goods, I think it's a good thing for everybody.
Thank you for that. That was quite bright how you turn the issue around. So it's how brands have to work on how to create more involvement, more engagement of the customers. So it's not only consumers who don't follow their brands. The new purchasing habits for the younger generation is all about knowing where the products come from, how it's done, how it's made, and the supply chain, the impact, the environmental impact as well is something that's quite taken in consideration. So that's an interesting way to turn around the problematic. We have a bit of time for questions and answer, maybe, or to have your perspective on different matters. I don't know if Marie, who's hosting the webinar, has some to pass us on, but that was quite interesting. And there we have a question from Marc-Henri Ménard. You did speak about consumer goods. What about where the industrial process, which are copied by competitors?
Well, that's a really interesting aspect, right? So the process, in fact, I was just looking at this last night. I was looking at, there's a manufacturing process for fibers that makes a material that we call tencel in the United States. And it's a mechanism for cutting those fibers up and reprocessing them to make a very soft fabric. And the history of that appears to have had some issues with copying, and they've had to work very, very hard at looking at authenticity of that. I think that's a great question because it gets at yet another area, right, where you can have copying that can cause problems if the process is not authorized. You're breaching the patent usually for that process. It's a process patent, and that is very, very problematic. From the consumer end or from the supply chain end, again, the quality of goods are usually impacted by this. But great question, because I think, yeah, just at each point you can actually find areas that you will either be imitated. So imitation is one thing, but malicious copying is also another. But both do harm to legitimate owners, which comes back to, again, when you are a business, you need to really come back to your strategy of, did I protect everything that I need to protect so that I could take action? For example, people will often file the patent on the goods, but to your question, maybe haven't sufficiently got the patent on the process or on the manufacturing process or the equipment needed for manufacturing. I was talking to someone who works in the automotive industry the other day, where they had a problem with the imitation of a mechanism for using one of the machines. Not protected, they had to figure out what to do. Or is it to do with your distribution channels? Or what is it that makes it special? Make sure that your organization actually looks and makes a decision about correct and appropriate protection of all of what it is that makes your product special and therefore protectable, because it can be quite a lot.
Definitely, and maybe going back to the initial topic of the conversation, in luxury companies, I personally know there's a counterfeiting department at the LVMH of every luxury companies. However, in the automotive industry, in the pharma industry, do they have had of fight against counterfeiting? Is that something that's established in these companies, or is it still struggling with reality and trying to admit it and fighting it?
No, absolutely. As I said, the customer of ours that has led really the way with the anti-counterfeiting app is a vehicle manufacturer, where they know that they need to go and take action. I so wish Pierre was on, because Pierre was telling us the other day that in his experience in the automotive industry, in fact, there can be, and I would argue now that I've heard of this role, I think we should think of internal investigations and an internal investigative role. So if you think about the problem that we have with, as I said, with grey market goods, this happens because employees are taking malicious action. In his experience, he was talking about electronic parts to vehicles and the problem of industrial espionage, and therefore the need for internal, very, very specialized investigation roles that were required to make sure that that this intellectual property was not sold, was not taken to competitors or other countries. And unfortunately, I think this is really important. That comes back, Aline, I think, to what I was talking about. So what is your strategy? Are you going to take a legal strategy? Are you going to take an internal and external strategy? So for us, with one of the brands that I maintained, we brought in a PR agency. We actually stood up a public relations function as part of the strategy to make sure that there was an awareness of the problem, the need to maintain and manage the brand properly, and to work against potential counterfeits that were going on. And so that was one arm of the strategy. So you've got everything from that to just, really good legal enforcement, which I think should go on anyway, all the way through, as Pierre was telling us, about these internal investigation positions for potential espionage. So, yeah.
Quite terrible. From the conversation we've had with him, apparently there are threats from one supplier to another because people use those counterfeits. So it's complicated. I like the idea that you involve the PR strategy, because if the brand doesn't anticipate these issues, it's only in the position of reacting.
Exactly.
When you're reacting to a problem, you don't have time to build a proper strategy. So luckily and thankfully, these huge industries such as automotive, aerospace, or pharmaceuticals are starting to address the problem with more proactivity and anticipates what are the different channels, what are the different dangers, but the PR behind it is going to be key.
Exactly. And Aline, this is not a bad point at which to talk to. I think that to address this, you actually need a multidisciplinary team. I think traditionally, you see this in my area, trademark attorney, I want to take action on trademarks. Well, sometimes the answer is not trademarks. Sometimes it's PR, sometimes it's patents, sometimes it's designs. So I think it's actually really important for everybody within an organization and for organizations to put together, as I said, multidisciplinary teams that are responsible for a part of that action or a part of the strategy for a company. I'd like to stand one up. I think that sounds sort of very, very interesting to be able to get people to think of a creative way of being impactful in the area of counterfeits.
Definitely the lately merged concept of task forces, where you have to gather different minds from different fields to address an issue that concerns everyone. And COVID has shown us also, the pandemic, the way the vaccines arrived in our lives was also the demonstration of how it is important to have proper products that go through approval to fasten up also the different processes, but having different type of intelligences combining to, well, make something better for everyone and safer.
Exactly.
Jayne, I'd like to thank you very much for exposing your perspective on this fascinating topic. I don't know if we have any upcoming questions, but we're reaching the end of our times. So if one should speak, it would be now, or at least not today. If not, maybe a few words of conclusion on your part. Is on the launch of the app Anaqua, is it already in place? How far is the project gone?
Yeah, it's already in place. We roll out 3 versions of our product a year, and so for our customers, they're sort of getting this rolling benefit of the product. If anyone's interested, please get them to reach out. We'd love to speak to people. I'd like to speak to people too. I'm always interested in where companies are in their awareness and action on counterfeits. And how that can be helped. So I challenge everyone to have a look around their desk today and think, how do you know that something I bought is authentic? What does it mean to you to buy something authentic? And does your attitude change when it might be something deep in something you're driving around? I will admit, the other day after our preparation discussion with Pierre, I drive a highly automated vehicle. I drive a Tesla. And I did drive down the road thinking, how would I know? I'm going to trust my vehicle manufacturer, and I'm sure they've got a great strategy for enforcing that. So,
and that's fair. Yeah, build trust, engagement, and brand trust. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your fascinating perspective. Looking forward to seeing you in January for our Innovation and IP Forum and Awards that will be held in Paris on the 25th of January. Have a great day and thank you for sharing. Have a great day.
Bye, Aline.
Bye. And thank you everyone for listening, of course.